Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. Oh, well, this week is likely not going to get as much traction as last week. But you know what? I'd argue if you dig deeply enough, even the off weeks can spark a lot of interesting conversation. So let's not waste any more time. This is On the Pulse. First up, from Little Big Town, Nightfall. I have no idea why Nashville radio doesn't really promote Little Big Town. The harmonies tend to be organic and accessible. They've got a baseline level of quality without being real trend hoppers. They can comfortably cross over if necessary. Oh wait, they're a mixed gender band and this is Nashville radio. Never mind. I think it's just a goddamn shame because between The Breaker and this album, the group is putting out some of their most mature and melodically satisfying material to date. And you could argue that by taking a few tentative steps into dream country, Nightfall, it's even better. Yes, midway through the album, you got the two drinking songs that can feel clunky as all hell, especially with all the horns blaring across wine, beer, whiskey. But when the album slips into sweeter atmospherics with rounded acoustics and gentle keys and touches of pedal steel and strings where the vocals are centered properly, it finally highlights Little Big Town's burnished potency. Kind of ironic that on the album where they finally locked into more tones that they can call their own, that now they're actually referencing Fleetwood Mac outright. I appreciate that. Now, like with every mixed gender country band, I always ask why they don't utilize a little bit more distinctive interplay between the singers beyond the dreamy River of Stars, and really giving Philip Sweet only one lead when he knocks Forever and a Night out of the park. It's damn near criminal. But when you consider that this might be their most robust collection of love and relationship songs that they've ever had, leaning into the maturity that's always been a secret strength of a band that's now over 2 decades into their career, I can't complain. And by the time you get into the goddamn incredible back half of the album, you got cuts with so much subtle progressive nuance like Questions and Sugarcoat and The Daughters, and the stunning slow burn closer Trouble with Forever. Even if this might wind up, well, being slept on by too many people, still a dream worth having. Solid 8 out of 10. You need to hear this. Check it out. Next up, from Anti-Flag, 2020 Vision. I'll admit my heart kind of sank when I saw somebody added Anti-Flag to my schedule because, full disclosure here, this was a sort of long-running punk band I just never really delved into growing up, which had a lengthy back catalog and no clear indication of what's essential listening. Now fortunately, once I got a few albums in and then found a greatest hits compilation, my opinion on Anti-Flag crystallized very fast. This is the definition of a comfort zone act. They've got a sound, they got a streamlined set of power chords and hammering bass lines and politically charged left-wing diatribes, and they haven't really diverged from it since the mid-90s. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a comfort zone act. You get real strikes bowling it straight down the middle, but for lifelong punk activists who have actively placed themselves in the front lines, it's hard not to feel like we're hearing more sloganeering than incisive rhetoric. A lot of populism, but no precision, and the power kind of gets dulled with repetition. Now, you'd think by doubling down on the political climate of the time that Anti-Flag would have all the material they need to really cut deeper, which is why it's frustrating that this project doesn't really rise above being just another Anti-Flag album across a lot of its runtime. Power chords, big overdub vocals with Justin Lane's increasingly fried out delivery, overly clean production, consistently great bass lines, and an undercurrent of weirdly shallow nihilism that I've never liked from this band. It gives me the frustrating feeling that they could swap out a few of these songs into albums from their glory days and not a lot would really change. Hell, songs like The Disease just feel incoherent with their metaphor, which does not help the album's potency or messaging. It's also one reason why I actually really like the incredibly blunt provocation of Christian Nationalist, which apparently has pissed off some of the fan base who has never bothered to pay attention to any of Anti-Flag's politics and then find themselves targeted or offended. I mean, sure, it's not really refined, nor even all that revolutionary in left-wing circles, but sometimes the hammer from the right source can still provoke a good reaction. It's also why when the album slides away from formula, it sticks out a little more, like the acoustic Un-American highlighting systemic sexism, classism, and racism, or the ska flair on the album closer, Resistance Frequencies. I mean, shame it didn't drill deeper, because at this point in their career, what does Anti-Flag have left to lose? They could experiment more, and I'd be fine with it. But as it is, look, it's another Anti-Flag album. It's decent enough for what it is. If you can't take that at this point, that might be on you. 6 out of 10 though, if you're curious. Next up, from Floral Tattoo, You Can Never Have a Long Enough Head Start. So if you've been on any online music communities, at the very beginning of the year, every wannabe critic is looking for the very first album they can rate highly or canonize. I mean, it rarely lasts, but the initial boost of momentum often keeps that project in the cultural conversation a little bit longer than you would expect. Not saying that Floral Tattoo wouldn't have gotten there on their own. Their debut cast them as a pretty decent and very queer emo group that flirted with a lot of shoegaze and power pop, but I'm almost positive they wouldn't have gotten the same attention this year if they hadn't dropped in the first few days of January. Now, that's not saying that they aren't good, because this is actually pretty promising. The gauzy chirp of the melodies that you can tell are homegrown, but are actually competently mixed and mastered, although I won't deny it gets kind of frustrating how often the vocals are just completely buried. Then you got the jagged waves of guitar off the surprisingly well-developed bass lines, the textured gleam of restlessness that still worms under your skin with some of the better hooks. But for as much as I appreciate the blunt, honest reality of the songwriting that still dares to be aspirational, I like that theme. It is playing with the very raw basics of this brand of Midwestern emo. It can feel a little bit underwritten in some of its details and storytelling, and the meandering progression can get a little bit exasperating and annoying when you're waiting for the album's stronger hooks to really cut loose or a little bit more lyrical flair. Now, granted, when they do on songs like She and The Art of Moving On, or the slow, explosive buildup of Ore House and Danny B. Well, they're absolutely worth it, but those moments are kind of patchy on the album as a whole. Still though, very good sophomore effort. Happy to see that it got attention. Let's see where they go from there. Light 7 out of 10. Take the time, check it out. Next up, from Temperance, Viridian. So it appears like over the next couple of weeks we're going to get new albums from the C-listers of symphonic metal. But you know what, given the overmixed frustration that was with Temptation's last album, no new Epica album in sight, and Nightwish's next release months away, I'm not averse to competition, with Delane's Apocalypse and Chill, dear god that album title, dropping in early February, and this new release from the Italian group Temperance. And after listening to their entire discography, look, I might have been spoiled early on with great symphonic metal, but great guitar solos and the occasional strong hook doesn't redeem underwhelming songwriting and really chintzy production that forgets what bass lines are. And that's before I discovered that before their 2018 album, they replaced their drummer, their rhythm guitarist, and their lead female vocalist, and actually got a lot better. Yeah, I'm as surprised as anyone there's no punchline here. Of Jupiter and Moons had no business being a great project, and while I'd still argue this band is a great producer away from getting in the big leagues, their new frontwoman, Alessia Scoletti, she is a powerhouse, and they're a lot more melodically robust than ever before. Now, unfortunately, Viridian is not on that level, and what's kind of exasperating is that it's for many of the same bad habits that have held Temperance back consistently for a while now. Overmixed synth blending, a lot of sloppy mixing of the drums and the bass guitar, and lyrics that just don't have a lot of unique character or any sort of larger thematic coherence beyond just trying to keep a constant sense of blazing tension, which might click for a few of the more environmentalist-leaning cuts, but can start to feel a little bit stale elsewhere. What's more critical, though, is a question of compositional dynamics. Temperance will burn through so many potent guitar melodies and hooks, and then cram their songs full of a lot of key changes, but these moments are rarely given the crescendos or the build-ups to feel as epic as they should. Modulation and dramatic contrasts are a thing, people, and without them, all the bombast starts sounding a little flat. And when you get cuts like Nanook, well, they're good, but the Nightwish influence is also pretty blatant. But hey, I can hear the pieces of Temperance making some pretty great symphonic power metal if they fine-tune some of the details, and they are better than when they started, so if you're a fan, 6 out of 10. Give it a chance, check it out. Next up, from Belore, Journey Through Mountains and Valleys. Okay, we're staying in metal. We got another slice of black metal, more on the atmospheric folk side coming through, this time from a relatively unknown debut from France and leaning into the epic medieval iconography across the content, some more diverse tones of the horns, the flutes, and the acoustic instrumentation, and even some of the compositional melodies. They got that medieval flair. And while claiming acts like Seor and Summoning as an easy way to get me through the door, you can also definitely tell that Belore hasn't quite found a stable footing just yet. For one, the grooves tend to be really underwhelming as a whole, with limited bass presence and really inconsistent drum work both in the mixing and the playing, which means that driving into greater bombast and explosive melodic crescendos get that much harder, and give this album a weird pompous stiffness that's not really helped by the choice in setting. This also ties into issues of song structure. When your transitions are limited to non-existent, shifts into more medieval bombast that kind of fall flat for me, especially when the less than organic fidelity of some of the backing arrangements starts to show through to make this seem a lot less epic. It doesn't help that the lyrics have the rather underwhelming and anonymous feel of your average by-the-numbers fantasy story, of which I've read hundreds. Short vignettes that wind up all the more disappointing for as conventional and lacking distinctive detail as they are. Which shouldn't be the case in epic fantasy. I don't know, it's not bad per se, but it's not really all that interesting, and I can't see myself returning to it that much. And one last thing, atmospheric black metal bands, you can stop ending your projects with acoustic codas anytime now. Getting a little more stale here, because this is a 5 out of 10. And it should be better. Next up, from Terry Allen and the Panhandle Mystery Band, Just Like Moby Dick.
We're the only ones in the world that even though she died.
Describing an artist like Terry Allen to even your average indie country fan always seems like a bit of an exercise in futility, but okay, here we go. He's a Texas singer-songwriter, spoken word poet, and painter who came up in the mid to late 70s and has spent the ensuing decades writing intensely detailed albums deconstructing pretty much every trope associated with it in hilarious fashion. He's most well known for the classic albums Juarez and Lubbock on Everything, which the latter is an album that has to be experienced to be believed, and ever since then I put him in a similar category as James McMurtry. Very brilliant, cantankerous, revolutionary, worldly without being pretentious, and also powerfully empathetic the deeper you read between the lines. Now this is his first album of original material since 2013, not counting the Pedal Steel Four Corners compilation released last year, and while I'd love to say that this is the sort of album you should just check out because of its subtle offbeat brilliance in the poetry and the warm, colorful production rich with traditional twangs, supple grooves, rich vocal harmonies, stunning fiddle and accordion, and even some weirder quirks to set off a more textured and unique vibe. That's all been true about the majority of Terry Allen's discography, and he still remains a bit of an acquired taste, especially as some of that 70s nihilism lingers, especially surrounding war and the art scene. City of the Vampires is exactly as heavy-handed as you think it might be once you figure out the metaphor, as is Little Puppet Thing. Now that said, even in his mid-70s, he hasn't lost a step as a songwriter, and there's a thematic richness that reveals more dimensions with every listen, amplified by the increased number of collaborators that he brought in this time around. And the metatext by their very presence, which we will get to, especially as you can tell that Terry Allen's mortality is weighing rather heavily on him in the thematic tangle of this album. Moby Dick might be the literary reference point, but it's more thematic in humanity's doomed last stands against death, contrasting the blazing hubris to face it alone on your own ego versus the acceptance and appreciation of those who will join together to laugh and love and sin along the way, where that collaborative metatext will then deepen the album, and a very telling inversion of the color symbolism, where white will symbolize a yawning emptiness and black being the life hard lived, sins and all. It's how the greatest tragedy of the album comes with an old stripper's forgotten passing, where a man of reason like Houdini still finds himself wishing for more in the spiritual realm, and how the album ends with calamity all around, but having found a sense of inner peace, along with a slyly brilliant Meatloaf reference that I'm not gonna spoil. Now, I'm not the one to label any project a swan song. There are very few artists who can predict how they'll go out, but if Terry Allen has this, its quiet brilliance deserves so much credit. Extremely solid 8 out of 10. Y'all need to hear this. It's something special. And finally, from Twin Atlantic, Power.
You fly my brain.
Okay, this is just a disclaimer for patrons here. If you're gonna request utterly milquetoast alternative rock that doesn't give me a lot to say, that's exactly the commentary you're gonna get. And if we're looking for the newest example, Twin Atlantic. On their early 2010s debut, they sounded like Gerard Way became Scottish, hired a really good bassist, and then proceeded to make the most indistinct radio rock imaginable. And unfortunately, it's only uneven from there. A bland and flatly produced stab at Switchfoot-esque power pop on their sophomore album. The third album kept the same flat production, then went for an overblown flat radio rock fuzziness that was a welcome improvement and could have still hit quality if the writing wasn't still milquetoast and the early 2010s garage blues revival didn't exist. And with this, can we say Imagine Dragon? Yeah, borrowing a meme from my boy Crash Thompson, but for as late as Twin Atlantic has been in chasing the trends, it's sadly no surprise they wound up here 2 years late with all the gated 80s percussion, clicking snaps, scratchy stuttering, gummy buzzsaw synths, ugly vocal pitch shifting, and crushing their reverb guitars into buzzy mush. There's no trap percussion, which seemed to imply the deeper influence might be the 1975 or maybe the Wombats, but it's an awful sign when a forgettable band hops on a bad trend and their most distinctive sound becomes their worst. I mean, by the nine hells, there's an interlude here called Mount Bungo that literally sounds like elongated, synthesized farts. Factor in truly awful sequencing, half-formed failures at synthwave groove like I Feel It Too, or just ripping off Depeche Mode wholesale with Messiah, and then a very incoherent, late-night, brooding album narrative with some painfully limited and basic poetry, and the fact that the entire album reads like an attempt to replicate Glitterbug 5 years too late. Yeah, this sucks. Was like the power Twin Atlantic needed? Just to be terrible all along. 3 out of 10, avoid this. So yeah, ending on a bit of a sour note, but yeah, get what you can for it. There is some great albums here you should definitely check out. Otherwise, though, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. And if you guys want to get albums on this schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there. Happy to see you guys hop on board. It's really special. But hey, till then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.